It's true. Generating sales is one of the best feelings you can have. But it's not even quite the end of the process. It's really a good feeling when you actually get cash in hand. Now we have to remember to do a couple of things to finish out this process. Believe it or not, I did work with a customer once who was really good about making invoices, but they never marked that any of them were paid. So this really stops the accounting process in its tracks. We don't want to use Peachtree as just a glorified word processor to create invoices. We need to be able to track the accounting. In this chapter, what we want to do is learn how to receive payments and how to make those bank deposits. That way, we can mark things as paid, close out the invoices, make sure we're not sending out statements that say things are overdue when they're not, as well as keeping our bank accounts in balance. If you are building your file along with me as I work through this course, you can simply keep that same company file open as we work. If you're just joining in, if you didn't follow all of the steps from the previous chapters, or if you simply want to start each chapter with a fresh file, you need to use a company file from the Project Files folder located on your desktop. The project files are actually backup files from my working file. They simply need to be restored in order for you to be able to use them. Go to the File menu, choose Restore, and work through the wizard to choose the backup from the file folder that you're going to be choosing from the desktop. Money can be received from customers in a variety of ways and at a variety of points in the sales process. You can enter receipts of payment right on the invoice like we saw in a prior chapter, or we can do it later using the Receipts window. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to move to the Tasks menu. And since we're kind of working progressively through the sales process, quotes and sales orders, invoicing, then the next step, or third option from the top, is to have receipts. You may be asked to select a cash account, which is going to be our regular checking account, so we'll say OK. And then, of course, we get into the actual receipts window. Now, the deposit ticket ID will either be a number that represents the current date, or it will be blank. It depends on how you set your defaults. Mine are set so that the deposit ticket ID won't be assigned until I actually make a deposit, so mine is blank, and that's just fine. Let's go ahead and choose a customer ID, and for us, we're talking about Beecham Real Estate. You'll notice, however, that when I choose Beecham and I move down to the bottom part of the box, that my first tab, Applied to Invoices, is not selected. As a matter of fact, I can't select it. The only thing that's available is Applied to Revenues. This should be something that raises a little bit of a red flag for you because we see it in other places in Peachtree as well. What this is telling me is that Beecham Real Estate currently doesn't show any invoices that are outstanding. And you say, well, I'm not quite sure how that can be true. I know I created the invoice, and if we look over on the right-hand side of our screen, kind of underneath in our center, it's a little bit covered up, but we can see that we do have Beecham Real Estate, and that it has an outstanding balance of $14,1750. So what the heck's going on? Well, don't forget that we have to follow processes in Peachtree. Those general accounting principles must be followed. So let's go ahead and close this out for just a second. And we'll say no to saving the changes. And we'll remember that through accounting, when we create the invoice, that's part of it. But technically, Peachtree says we haven't informed the customer of the invoice because we haven't printed or sent it yet. So let's go ahead and do that step. Let's move up to the Tasks menu and take it back just one step in our process by going back to Sales and Invoicing. Let's go to Print, select Invoices to print, and then, of course, from our drop-down, we can see that one of our filter options is, do we want to do printed or currently unprinted invoices? Well, we want to go ahead and process all of our unprinted invoices, so that'll be our selection criteria. We could also put in dates and those types of things. We're going to start with Invoice 101, and we're going to use a specific form. We notice on the right-hand side that it's still blank, so we need to click on the Refresh List button on the upper right to have it go ahead and requery the system and show us all of the invoices that meet our criteria. Now we get to see our Beecham invoice for $14,1750. We make sure it has a checkbox. We'll come down to the bottom of the dialog and click Print Email. We'll say OK to run through the print process, and then say yes, they printed OK. That brings us back to Invoices, and we can close this window as well. With that little bit of task finished out, because we don't want to forget that, then we'll go back to Tasks, Receipts, select our cash account, select our customer, and surprise, surprise, or maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, now we get to see Apply to Invoices selected as the default tab, and it shows our invoice as we would expect to see it. So always remember that if you're not seeing what you need to be seeing, or when you're working with these different types of dialogues that have two different tabs, if you're not seeing a purchase order or an invoice or something like that that can be applied, it means that you probably missed a step somewhere in between. In this case, it's an important step because we never sent the invoice to our customer. How can we get a receipt or expect money in back if we haven't sent it? Now that I've given you that little lecture, let's go ahead and finish this up. I've kind of come up with a unique scenario. I don't just want to pay the invoice because I want to show you how to work with some of the kind of irregular types of payments that you'll have. Our client has actually underpaid by $1. Now we're not going to carry this over. We're going to write it off so that we'll enter the full invoice amount here. And then we're going to enter the write-off amount as a negative amount on the Apply to Revenues tab. Okay, so why are we doing this? Well, the invoice amount is $1417.50. They paid us $1416.50, but we don't want to carry over $1. It's a new account. The dollar isn't a big deal on an invoice of this size. So let's go ahead and process the first part. I'll click in description. And my habit, it's not the only way to do it, but is to be fairly descriptive in the description. So I'm going to type something like this. Invoice number 101, paid in full. Now, I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, when I see a report that summarizes a transaction, it tells me what invoice it is being applied to. I don't have to drill down into the details to find that out. It also tells me that even though it was short, it was paid in full. But I actually put that even if it was paid in full, again, because it just makes it easy to identify what's happening with the transaction. We can see that a discount has automatically been applied. And if you're trying to figure out where that came from, it's because this customer has a discount if they paid within 10 days. So Peachtree knows that, and they've automatically calculated a 3% discount off of the total, which happens to be $42.53. Now remember, we're going to put in the full amount of the invoice here so that in the accounting, it actually shows the invoices paid. If we put it in short for $1, then it's going to show that they still owe money, and this invoice will remain open, and that's going to cause problems later on. All right, so there's the first part. Now let's click on the Apply to Revenues tab, and let's do the other side of this transaction. We have a quantity of 1. We don't have an item that was purchased, so we'll skip over that, and we do want to put in a description. Something like this might work. Client underpayment not carried over. That explains why this line item is here, and the fact that we're doing it is because we don't want to carry that over as $1 still owed. The next thing you need to do is check your GL account, and that's going to be your charge-off account or your write-off account. For us, that's account 61,500. Then, of course, we'll put in our unit price, which is a -1. And that takes care of our accounting. So what we did is we entered the full invoice amount, but we can't keep that because then our bank account would be off by $1. So we created a second revenue of -$1 that's going to go to our charge-off account because we do have to keep track of it. And you'll see up on the top of the screen that it means the receipt amount, the amount going into our checking account, is going to be $1,416.50. Now, if somebody overpaid, maybe they overpaid by 3 or 4 cents, you could do the same type of thing. I think you have to be careful with overpayments because, believe it or not, people do get upset if they paid you 10 cents extra and you're not giving them credit for that. But the process would be the same, except in that case, you would be entering a positive amount here. The whole point is that you're doing the accounting to make sure that the amount of money you're actually depositing matches what you received, and it's all accounted for either being applied to an invoice or applied to a revenue as a positive or negative amount. The second half that's important is making sure that you apply the full amount to the invoice, otherwise the invoice will remain open or it will show a credit. So we've done a good job with this one. You can go ahead and do much simpler receipts of payment, but this one gives you a little bit of an example on how you might work with irregular deposits. Now that we've gone through all of that, we need to go ahead and save it. So as we are very used to, I'll click Save. It tells us that we do always have to enter a reference number, so I'll say OK. And this actually brings us back to the top of the window. Now we said that we don't need a deposit ticket ID. We obviously need to have the customer to know who it's coming from, but we also have to have some type of a reference. You'll notice there's also a receipt number. So if we were creating something else with receipt numbers, we could do that, or we can create that a little bit later. I'll go ahead and put in this reference because they paid by check. So we'll put in a reference that's very common, CHK, and then the number of the actual check. Let me press Tab. You know, there's always all kinds of different things that can happen in the real world, and I like to try to cover these so you're not left wondering what you're supposed to do with them. So here's a couple more quick tips before we finish out this lesson. You can create a receipt without actually having an invoice by only entering information on the Apply to Revenues tab. That could also be something like a prepayment because it's not going to an invoice yet, and then we could apply the credit later on. Also, if you don't want to add a person as a customer, and this would be maybe in a retail setting where they came in and bought, something for a quarter, and you don't want to go through the process of adding them as a customer, you'll probably never see them again, then you can add them without adding a customer by skipping the customer ID and just entering information into the name box. So there's a couple of different things, again, for different scenarios that you also might encounter when receiving money on behalf of your company. And now let me try to click Save one more time. And then close. And now we've successfully completed a receipt for payment.